Great Migration and the Second Great Migration were two major waves of mass movement in the United States, in which millions of African Americans relocated from the rural South to the urban North and West. Now, these migrations profoundly reshaped the social, political, cultural, and economic landscape of the country. The Great Migration from 1910 to 1940 marked the beginning of this large scale relocation, while the new migration, Second Great Migration, from 1940 and 1970, it significantly expanded and intensified it. So, the Great Migration, so the causes of the Great Migration from these years, from the 30-year time span. So, the Great Migration was a mass exodus of approximately 1.6 million African Americans from the rural South to urban centers in the North and Midwest during the second period from 1910 to 1940. And this demographic shift, it was driven by a combination of push and pull factors rooted in economic, social, and political conditions. So when it comes to the factors, the push factors, pretty much it talks about more like of the conditions in the South. So on one hand, it was the Jim Crow laws and systemic oppression. So following the end of the Reconstruction in 1877, the Southern states implemented Jim Crow laws, enforcing racial segregation and codifying white supremacy. So these laws mandated separation in public spaces, including in schools and transportation and restaurants and even restrooms, and the legal framework of disenfranchisement. So this included poll taxes, which are fees that were intentionally unaffordable for many black citizens. Also, you had literacy tests, and these were often designed with obscure or confusing questions to disqualify black voters, and the grandfather clauses. And these were so pretty much what these did is that it exempted white citizens from literacy tests and poll taxes if their ancestors had voted before 1867, effectively barring African Americans from voting. And by 1910, the black voter turnout in the South had plummeted due to these discriminatory measures, leaving African Americans politically powerless. And another is racial terror and violence. So the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK, and other white supremacist groups, they waged terror campaigns to intimidate and control black communities. So lynching it became a brutal and public tool of racial violence. So according to the NAACP, over 3,000 documented lynchings of black Americans occurred between 1882 and 1940. So spectacle lynchings often drew large white crowds and were publicized in newspapers, further traumatizing black communities. So white mobs, they also frequently targeted black landowners and prosperous farmers, using violence to seize land and destroy economic gains. And another is the economic exploitation with the sharecropping and tenant farming. Now, in the post-slavery era, many black families became sharecroppers or tenant farmers, bound to white landowners. The sharecropping system, so what this did was is that it kept black farmers in a cycle of peonage. So what happened was they rented land and equipment in exchange for a share of the harvest, but they were often subjected to fraudulent accounting practices by white landlords, and black farmers were systematically cheated, leaving them unable to escape poverty. And there was also debt bondage, which prevented economic mobility, making northern factory jobs more appealing. And you also had natural disasters, such as the boll weevil infestation. So in the 1910s, the boll weevil infestation devastated cotton crops across the South. And the insect, it destroyed over 60% of cotton yields in some areas. And by the mid 1910s, worsening the economic plight of black farmers. So, with fewer employment opportunities and increased destitution, migration to the north became a financial necessity for many families. And the pull factors. So the factors that overall that pulled African Americans in. So it was opportunities in the North. So you had industrial jobs and higher wages. So the outbreak of World War I from 1914 to 1918, it created a labor shortage in the North, which was due to war-related production because there was a lot of increased demand for steel, textiles, and munitions, and also the reduced European immigration. Immigration restrictions during the war, it reduced the supply of white immigrant labor, and northern industrialists, so they actively recruited black southerners, offering higher wages than the agricultural jobs in the South. And an example is that in 1916, so like the Illinois Central Railroad, it hired over 1,000 black workers from Mississippi alone. And wages in the northern factories, they were often 2 to 3 times higher than southern farm labor. And also another factor was the recruitment by the northern companies. So companies such as US Steel or Ford Motor Company and the meatpacking plants, they sent labor agents to southern towns. They distributed pamphlets and posters promising steady work, better wages, and the hope of dignity and freedom. And recruitment efforts, it often included free rail passes, and relocation assistance. And also the role of the black newspapers. So, black owned newspapers such as the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, they all played a key role in promoting migration. And the Chicago Defender published glowing accounts of the North, urging black Southerners to leave behind the oppression of the South. And the paper regularly ran job advertisements and train schedules for migrating families. And articles even highlighted the North as a land of opportunity and freedom from Jim Crow oppression. So when it comes to the patterns of migration, so the first wave of the Great Migration, you saw 1.6 million African Americans leave the South, and primarily they were setting in urban centers in the North and Midwest. So major destinations. So when it comes to the Midwestern cities, you had cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. So these cities, they became major hubs. So Chicago's black population, it grew from 44,000 in 1910 to over 230,000 by 1940. And when it comes to Detroit, their black population expanded from 5,700 in 1910 to 120,000 by 1940. And the northeastern cities, such as New York City, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Boston. So the black population of Harlem in New York, it surged, making it a cultural epicenter. And then the urban expansion and segregation. So African Americans, they often settled in racially segregated neighborhoods due to housing discrimination, and black enclaves such as Paradise Valley in Detroit, South Side in Chicago, and Harlem in New York. They all became centers of black life and culture. So the impact of the Great Migration. So a lot of the impact comes with, for one, it's the urban expansion and segregation. So African Americans, so they faced a lot of systemic housing discrimination through restrictive covenants, which were contracts that prohibited the sale of homes to black families. And you had redlining. And redlining, so this was pretty much, government backed policies by the homeowners loan corporation, and this denied black neighborhoods access to mortgages. So these practices, they confined black migrants to overcrowded, poorly maintained neighborhoods. And black communities, despite the discrimination, they created thriving cultural and social networks, including churches, businesses, and civic organizations. And the labor and economic changes. So African Americans, they became a vital part of the industrial labor force, working in steel mills and railroads, meatpacking plants, and automobile factories. And despite the economic improvements, black workers were often relegated to menial and low wage positions, and they were also excluded from labor unions, which were predominantly white. And you also add in the cultural and artistic impact with the Harlem Renaissance. So the migration, it fueled the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, which was a golden age of black culture and music. So you had jazz legends like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong who revolutionized who revolutionized American music. And with literature, you had writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston. They expressed the black experience through poetry and prose. And when it came to art, the movement they fostered on rich visual art scene that depicted black life and struggle. And so the arrival of black migrants in northern cities, it exasperated racial tensions, which led to violent race riots. So you had the East St. Louis massacre in 1917. Now, the causes of the East St. Louis massacre were that white workers, they feared black competition for industrial jobs, and white mobs, they accused black workers of strike breaking. And the violence occurred on July 2nd, 1917, with the white mobs rampaged through black neighborhoods, murdering over 100 black residents. And thousands of black homes were burned, and the massacre even shocked the nation, and it also prompted the NAACP protests as well. And you also had the Chicago race riot of 1919. And the causes of this riot was the competition for housing and jobs, and also the racial tension over the use of public beaches. So on July 27, 1919, a white mob stoned and drowned Eugene Williams, who was a black teenager. And the violence, it escalated into 5 days of riots, leaving 38 people dead, 23 who were black and 15 that were white. And over 1,000 black families were homeless. And you also had the Red Summer Massacre. And the massacre, so this was a wave of over 25 race riots that swept the country. And cities that were affected were cities like Washington, D.C., Omaha, and Knoxville. And the white mobs, they attacked black neighborhoods, resulting in hundreds of deaths and the destruction of black communities. And you also have the second Great Migration. And the second Great Migration, it occurred from 1940 to 1970. So the same thing pretty much with the Great Migration. So what were the push and the pull factors of the second Great Migration? So when it comes to the causes, the push factors were similar to the Great Migration. So yeah, the Jim Crow laws and racial oppression. So the pervasiveness of Jim Crow laws in the South, it subjected African Americans to systemic discrimination. And enacted in the late 19th century, these laws mandated racial segregation in public facilities and schools, transportation, and housing. And there were also voter suppression tactics, including, once again, similar to the Great Migration, the literacy test, the poll taxes, and intimidation by the white supremacist groups effectively disenfranchised black voters. And there was also this one, it was a Supreme Court decision, no, a Supreme Court decision that was known as Plessy versus Ferguson. And this decision, so really this Supreme Court decision, it upheld the separate but equal doctrine, and pretty much it provided legal justification for continued segregation and inequality. And you also had racial violence, and racial violence remained a constant threat, with the lynchings and the mob attacks terrorizing black communities. And according to the NAACP's records, between 1900 and 1940, 3,400 African Americans were lynched in the South, creating a climate of fear that spurred migration. And you also had mechanization of agriculture and economic displacement. So by the 1940s, the mechanization of southern agriculture, it drastically reduced the demand for manual labor. sharecropping and tenant farming, which had sustained many black families, it became less viable as tractors, mechanical cotton pickers, and combines replaced human labor. And this technological shift, it displaced thousands of black agricultural workers, leaving them with few employment options in the rural South. And also, once again, the boll weevil infestation of the 1920s and the 1930s, it further devastated the cotton crops, which worsened the economic conditions for black farmers. And racial terror and intimidation, because the KKK and other white supremacist groups, they escalated campaigns of violence using arson, beatings, and murder to enforce white supremacy. Southern police forces and legal and so yeah, so Southern police forces and local governments, they often turn a blind eye or they were complicit in the violence. So the Columbia race riot in Tennessee and the Monroe massacre in 1946 in Georgia, they were examples of post-war racial violence that underscored that underscored the continued threat to black lives in the South. So the pull factors, so the opportunities in the North and the West and the Sun Belt. So the onset of World War II, so it created a massive labor shortage in northern and western industrial centers, as many white men enlisted or they were drafted into the military. So to meet the production demands, companies actively recruited black workers. So, for example, the Detroit auto industry, it became a major employer with factories producing vehicles, tanks, and aircraft. And you had shipyards in California, in Los Angeles, and Oakland, and San Francisco, which needed laborers for building naval vessels. And steel plants in Pittsburgh and in Cleveland hired thousands of black workers. So the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1941, it aimed to prevent discrimination in defense industry hiring, providing black workers with more employment opportunities. And you also have the defense industry and the federal employment. So the defense industry boom during and after the war, it opened up new jobs to black Americans, particularly in cities with large war-related industries. So government jobs, such as those in the US Post Office and other federal agencies, it provided stable wages, pensions, and upward mobility. So many black veterans having served during the war, they sought better paying industrial jobs rather than returning to sharecropping in the South. And you also had the rise of the black middle class. So the increased access to government jobs, education, and skilled labor, it allowed many African Americans to enter the middle class. And the GI Bill, although often inequitably distributed, it did help some black veterans obtain higher education and vocational training, contributing to upward mobility. And black professionals in fields such as education, healthcare, and public service, they became more prominent, expanding the black middle class. And the westward expansion and the Sun Belt. So, unlike the first Great Migration, which primarily involved the migration to the north, the second Great Migration, it saw significant movement westward and into the Sun Belt. So cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Seattle, they became major black urban centers. And the southern cities, including Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta, they also became destinations, particularly as they industrialized and offered more job opportunities. So the patterns of the migration. So when it comes to the scale of the migration. So between 1940 and 1970, approximately 5 million African Americans they relocated from the South to the North, the West, and the Sun Belt. Now, unlike the first Great Migration, which was primarily to northern cities, like I said before, this one expanded to the western cities and industrial hubs. So the key destinations were that you had West Coast cities. So West Coast cities such as with Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco, and Seattle. So For Los Angeles, the black population, it grew from 63,774 in 1940 to over 350,000 by 1970. And in Oakland and San Francisco, the Bay Area shipbuilding industry, it attracted black workers, creating thriving black neighborhoods. And in Seattle, the city saw a significant increase in its black population due to employment opportunities at Boeing and naval shipyards. And when it comes to the northern industrial cities, you have Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia. So, Chicago, black migrants continue to flock to Chicago, with the black population increasing from 277,000 in 1940 to 1.2 million by 1970. And in Detroit, the automobile industry, it offered abundant jobs, making Detroit a major destination. And with New York and Philadelphia, so the black populations in these cities, they expanded, particularly in Harlem, in Brooklyn, and in North Philadelphia. And the Sun Belt cities. So the Sun Belt cities with Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta. So the post-war economic growth in these cities, it attracted black migrants, and they also offered lower costs of living and employment opportunities in manufacturing and construction and service industries. So the impact of the second great migration. So the impact of this is demographic and urban changes. So urban growth and overcrowding. So the influx of black migrants, it led to the rapid expansion of black neighborhoods, often resulting in overcrowding and poor living conditions. And many cities, they maintain racially restrictive covenants, confining black residents to segregated neighborhoods. And you also had urban renewal programs because in the 1950s and the 1960s, frequently displaced black residents, furthering segregation and poverty. And you also had the white flight and the urban decline. So the rise of white flight, it saw white residents move to the suburbs, taking with them tax revenues, political influence, and economic resources. And the black urban neighborhoods, they became increasingly isolated and underfunded, contributing to poverty and infrastructure decline. And also, when it comes to the political and the civil rights influence, so when it comes to the voting power and representation, the concentration of black voters in northern and western cities, it increased their political influence because the migration, it contributed to the election of black mayors such as Carl Stokes in Cleveland in 1967 and Richard Hatchard in Gary, Indiana in 1968. And the civil rights movement, because migrants, they brought southern resistance and activism to urban centers, fueling the civil rights movement. And organizations such as the NAACP, and also the CORE, also known as the Congress of Racial Equality, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they all gained strength in northern and western cities. And also the cultural and the social impact. So when it comes down to the rise of black arts, the music, and the culture, the migration, it shaped the emergence of soul, Motown, and funk music, with artists like Marvin Gaye, James Brown, and Aretha Franklin, reflecting the black urban experiences. And then with the Black Power movement, the migration contributed to the rise of the Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland in 1966, advocating for self defense and community empowerment. So, generally speaking, when it comes down to both migrations, the first great migration and the second great migration, so there is a lot of comparison and a lot of contrast between both the migrations. So, the first thing that we want to dive into, because these two distinct ways of African American migration to northern and western cities in the U.S. So both of these represent pivotal periods in the African American experience, reflecting the changing social, political, and economic conditions of the country. And both migrations, they involve large numbers of Black Americans leaving the South. Yet their motivations, the destinations, and the broader societal impacts diverged in key ways. So by comparing both of these movements, we gain a more deeper insight into the transformation of African American communities and their role in shaping the modern United States. So the first thing to talk about is the size of migration. So with the Great Migration, it saw roughly 1.6 million African Americans leave the rural South for northern cities between 1910 and 1940. And it was primarily driven by the desire for better economic opportunities and also escaping the harsh racial violence of the South and also the promise of industrial jobs in the urban North. So African Americans sought to improve their economic and social mobility, hoping to achieve greater autonomy and fewer racial restrictions than they had faced in the Jim Crow South. The majority of migrants moved to industrial hubs like Chicago, New York City, and Detroit. And the migration was often a response to the labor shortages during World War One, and also a chance to escape systemic racism and disenfranchisement. And with the second great migration, which occurred between 1940 and 1970, now this was far larger, involving around 5 million African Americans, and it was more spread out geographically compared to the earlier wave. So while the North and the major industrial cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, while yes, they did remain to be significant destinations, there was a notable shift that occurred as African Americans they moved to new regions, so the new regions, such as the West, with Los Angeles and San Francisco, and then the Sun Belt cities of Atlanta, Houston, Miami. So the growth of defense industry jobs during World War II, and as well as the post-war economic boom, they all played a critical role in attracting African Americans to new opportunities in these regions. So the new migration, so the second one, so this was influenced not only by the economic factors, but also by the changing political climate and a heightened awareness of civil rights issues and the key destinations. So the Great Migration, so the key destinations for this, whether you had Chicago, you had Detroit, and you had New York City, specifically Harlem. So Chicago, it was known for its burgeoning manufacturing industry, and it became a central hub for Black migrants. And the city, it offered jobs in steel mills, in meat packing plants, and other industrial sectors. And it also developed a vibrant cultural life with the emergence of jazz, the blues, and other art forms. And Detroit. So, as the center of the automobile industry, Detroit attracted many African Americans with the promises of well paying jobs. The city's large industrial base provided an economic haven for migrants from the South. And New York City and Harlem. So Harlem became a cultural center for African Americans, which marked a high point in Black cultural production with the Harlem Renaissance. And the promise of intellectual and artistic freedom, it drew many Southern migrants to Harlem, where they were exposed to an environment of Black self expression. And the second great migration. So you had key areas, so key destinations such as of Los Angeles and the Sun Belt cities of Atlanta, Houston, and Miami. So Los Angeles, so the West Coast, it became an important destination with African Americans moving to California for work in film, in defense, and manufacturing industries. And Los Angeles provided a slightly more integrated social environment, offering a new frontier for migration. And the Sun Belt cities, so the Sun Belt encompassing the parts of the Southeast and the Southwest became a crucial new area of migration because the South was beginning to experience a shift with industrial development and the availability of new jobs in cities like Atlanta and Houston. And by the 1960s, the civil rights activism was increasingly centered in these regions, creating an environment of social change and opportunity. And speaking of opportunity, there's also the job opportunities. So the Great Migration, the motivations economically behind this were primarily centered on the search for industrial jobs, and they were often related to the manual labor and the factory work, which was readily available in the northern industrial hubs. So key areas where African Americans found work, it included steel mills, meat packing plants, and the railroads. So these industries, particularly in Chicago and Detroit, they were the driving forces behind the migration. Although these jobs were often grueling and low paying, they still provided black migrants with the chance to earn wages that were far higher than those in the South, where sharecropping and agricultural labor dominated, and the menial labor. So for many migrants, opportunities they were still limited to low paying, to low status positions, but the industrial cities of the North provided more stability compared to the volatile and exploitative uh, economy of the agricultural in of the South. And with the second Great Migration, it was largely influenced by the expansion of the defense industry and the overall post-war economic boom. And the key job sectors. So the key job sectors that attracted African Americans during this period included defense industry jobs. So World War II, it created a massive demand for workers in the defense industry, including shipbuilding, munitions, and aircraft manufacturing. In cities like Los Angeles and Oakland, they saw a significant influx of African Americans moving for defense work. And government jobs, because the rise of the federal government as a key employer during the New Deal and later the post war reforms, it provided many African Americans with opportunities in civil service. And this was particularly evident in cities like Washington, D.C., and other governmental hubs. And you also had white collar work because the post war economy, it actually led the growth of white collar jobs, particularly in the education, the government, and corporate America. So although African Americans, they were often restricted from the highest echelons, the growing middle class in the North and the West created opportunities for those who migrated. And then we talk about the cultural impact. So the Great Migration. So one of the most profound developments was the Harlem Renaissance, which was a flowering of African American art, literature, and music and intellectual thought in Harlem. So in Harlem during this period, it became a center of African American intellectual and cultural life, producing figures like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Duke Ellington. And the arts, they flourished, contributing to the cultural recognition of African Americans in mainstream society, and the jazz and the blues. So, as African Americans, as they relocated to cities like Chicago and New York, they brought with them the sounds of the South, which influenced the development of jazz, of blues, and the gospel music, genres that had a significant impact on American culture at large. And with the Second Great Migration, the impact of this one was equally transformative, but it was transformative in different ways because it saw the rise of new social and cultural movements. So Motown and the rise of black music. So Detroit, it became the heart of the Motown sound in the 1960s with artists like Stevie Wonder, the Supremes, and Marvin Gaye coming to prominence. And Motown and later other black music movements, they played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement, serving as a source of inspiration and a platform for social change. And the Black Power movement. So the migration to cities like Oakland, to New York, and Chicago, it helped foster a more politically active African American community. So the emergence of the Black Power movement in the 1960s and the 70s, it brought about a new cultural ethos focused on pride, self determination, and economic independence. And the political influence. So, the Great Migration, the influence of this politically during this migration was it was somewhat limited because while they did participate in local politics in the North, they were still politically marginalized, and their influence on national elections and policy it wasn't really strongly felt at this time because the migration now it set the groundwork for later political activism, but it was more but really it was largely more focused on economic survival and adaptation in the North. And in the Second Great Migration, so by this time they were starting to wield more starting to wield more significant power. Yes. So starting to wield more significant political power, and it helped build urban political machines, especially in northern cities where they began to run for and win political office. And the most notable political change it actually came with the increased black political representation. So in the 1960s and 1970s, African Americans gained greater representation in the local and the national governments, culminating in the election of leaders like Maynard Jackson in Atlanta and Carl Stokes in Cleveland. And this period, it also saw the rise of political activism in cities like New York and Chicago, where African Americans they became more involved in advocating for civil rights, labor rights, and anti-poverty measures. And then the civil rights impact. So in the Great Migration, the Great Migration it laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement by increasing the concentration of African Americans in northern cities, where racial segregation was less rigid but still present. While the migrants of the period they still faced discrimination, their relocation to the north it allowed for setting the stage for civil rights activism. So the urban centers they became hotbeds of activism and organization, setting the stage for the mass movements of the 1950s and 1960s. And the migration, it created a critical mass of politically conscious African Americans who would go on to lead civil rights struggles. And the Second Great Migration, it directly influenced, so really it directly fueled. It fueled the civil rights movement. And African Americans who migrated during this period they all became deeply involved in efforts to end segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination. And the contributions include the civil rights movement. So African American communities in cities like Montgomery and Birmingham and in Atlanta, they played critical roles in the movement with mass protests, sit-ins, and the establishment of organizations like the NAACP and the SCLC as well. So these efforts they resulted in landmark legal victories, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So, what are some lessons that we ourselves can learn when it comes to learning a lot of information about both these migrations? So a lot of lessons that we can learn is that on one hand, it's the social and economic push and the pull factors. So really for us, we need to understand the role of the Jim Crow laws, the racial violence and economic exploitation in pushing African Americans out of the South, and also learning how the industrial jobs and the higher wages and opportunities for freedom in the North and the West, how they acted as pull factors during both the migrations and the impact on urbanization and segregation. So we need to examine on how the migration, how it led to the formation of black enclaves in cities like Harlem, Chicago South Side, and Detroit's Paradise Valley. And also to study how segregation and systemic housing discrimination, such as redlining and restrictive covenants, how they shape these communities. And others are the labor and the economic changes. So we need to analyze how African Americans how they contributed to the industrial labor force in northern cities, and also recognize how these economic changes affected their socioeconomic mobility, despite challenges like low wages and limited and upward movement, and the cultural and the artistic movements. So it's up to us to learn more and investigate about the Harlem Renaissance and its role in elevating Black culture and music and literature and art during the Great Migration, and learning how the second Great Migration, the New Migration, how it influenced the rise of soul music, Motown, and the Black Power movement in urban centers. And the last two lessons is that it's political and the civil rights influence. So we need to understand how the migration, how it increased African American political power, particularly in northern and western cities, leading to the election of Black mayors, and learn how those migrations, how they set the stage for the key civil rights movement events, such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington, and the long term demographic and the social changes. So we need to compare how the demographic makeup of cities like Los Angeles and Detroit, how they changed as a result of the migration, and studying the social impact of the migration on urban centers, including issues like overcrowding and the effects of white flight. And also, finally, the questions that we a lot of times have to answer and have to question, once again, these are questions that you can answer on your own time. And like I said before, this is not quizzes, it's not any tests at all whatsoever. So, like I said, once again, if you have time on your hands, please do take the time to answer questions that I have posted here. So, when it comes down to the questions that I have up here in front, so questions overall that we must look forward and we must understand, we must answer is, on one hand, what were the main causes of the Great Migration, and how did these causes how do these causes differ from those of the new migration, and how did the migration patterns, how did they change from 1910 to 1940 to 1940 to 1970, and what were the social, political, and the cultural impacts of the Great Migration on African Americans in northern cities? And also, how did the labor force participation, how did it evolve from the Great Migration to the new migration? And how did the political landscape, how did it shift in northern and western cities as a result of the new migration? And other questions are, what role? So, what role did Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender, what did it play in encouraging migration? And what's the relationship between the migrations and the civil rights movement? And how did the Great Migration and the New Migration, how did it affect African American families and communities? And how did the racial tensions in northern cities, such as the Chicago race riot of 1919, how did it reflect the challenges of the migration? And then, what long-term effects did both migrations have on African American culture and identity? So the Great Migration and the Second Great Migration. So both of these movements, they reshaped the demographic, the cultural, and political fabric of the United States. African Americans, they left the rural South in pursuit of better economic opportunities and freedom from systemic racism. Their relocation, it led to the growth of Black urban communities, the rise of influential cultural movements, and the eventual push for civil rights and political power. Both migrations were instrumental in transforming the landscape of race relations in America. And ladies and gentlemen, that does it here this evening. So always remember that no matter the challenge, always be smooth, always be steady, and always be aggressive. Stay focused, stay determined, and keep pushing forward. And until next time, keep rising to the occasion. Peace.